A woman threw money on the floor of a restaurant and told a waiter he would never amount to anything. She did it in front of a table full of investors, in front of the entire dining room, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been wrong before. She bet $100,000 that he couldn't speak a single sentence in Mandarin. The room waited, half amused, half uncomfortable. Ryan Carter turned back toward the table, opened his mouth and spoke fluently, precisely without hesitation. Every investor at that table went still. Evelyn Brooks had no idea what she had just started. Sterling House was the kind of restaurant that made people feel important just by walking through the door. The lighting was low and deliberate, the kind that softened faces and made wine look deeper in the glass. Every table was dressed in white linen that had been pressed so precisely it looked architectural. The hostess stand was staffed by a woman who had clearly been trained to smile in a way that communicated exclusivity without saying a word. The menu changed seasonally and was never posted online. Reservations required a minimum of 2 weeks' notice unless you were the kind of person whose assistant called ahead to ensure an exception was made. San Francisco had no shortage of places like this, but Sterling House had a reputation that the others quietly envied. Ryan Carter had worked the floor here for 2 years. He moved through the dining room the way someone moves through a space they know well, but have never fully claimed efficient, unobtrusive aware of every table's status, without having to look directly at any of them. He was 35 with the kind of face that didn't draw attention in either direction. He wore the restaurant's uniform, well, not because it suited him, but because he had learned long ago that the way you carried yourself inside a uniform mattered more than the uniform itself. Nobody who looked at him tonight would have guessed much about his life. That was fine. That was in many ways the point. The reservation for the private dining area had come in 3 weeks earlier. A party of 7 members of an overseas investor delegation, plus Evelyn Brooks and 4 members of her advisory team, booked under the name of Brooks Capital Group, requesting full buyout of the East Wing for an evening that the reservation notes described only as a strategic dinner. Ryan had been assigned to the table by the floor manager, a compact, methodical man named Gerald, who had simply said, "This one matters. Don't make it complicated." Ryan had nodded and thought nothing more of it. Every table at Sterling House by definition mattered. That was the premise of the place. Evelyn Brooks arrived 20 minutes before her guests. She came in wearing a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, her posture announcing her presence before her face did. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back tightly, and the kind of composure that read less like calm and more like control. The distinction being that calm is something you feel, and control is something you perform. She swept through the room without looking at anyone in particular, requested a menu change at the last moment, and moved 2 chairs from one end of the table to the other for reasons she did not explain. The junior staff moved around her without making eye contact. Ryan watched from across the room and made a quiet assessment. This was a woman who had spent years ensuring that rooms reorganized themselves around her, and it had become so routine, she no longer noticed she was doing it. Her 2 advisors arrived shortly after her, men in their late 40s, carrying the particular brand of competence that comes with being permanently attached to someone more powerful than yourself. They set up at the far end of the table with laptops and folders, and the organized efficiency of people whose job it was to make someone else look prepared. Ryan brought them water without being asked. Neither looked up to acknowledge it. The investors arrived in a group, all 7 of them, led by a man named Robert Walsh, though Ryan would not learn his name until later. The delegation had flown in from overseas, a mix of executives and financial partners, representing a consortium with significant holdings across Pacific Rim infrastructure and commercial real estate. They were impeccably dressed, polite in the way that people are polite, when they are also evaluating everything, and they spoke to each other in Mandarin with the relaxed fluency of people who had forgotten that not everyone in the room understood them. Among them was a woman named Patricia, who carried a slim notebook and moved through the introductions with the quiet focus of someone who had learned that observation was more valuable than participation. Evelyn greeted them all in English, warm and precise, and the introductions moved briskly. This was a dinner with a purpose, and everyone at the table knew what that purpose was. Ryan began the service. Wine was poured, menus were presented. The kitchen was informed of 2 dietary restrictions that had come through at the last moment. He worked quietly and carefully, the way he always did, keeping the rhythm of the table steady without inserting himself into the atmosphere. At one point early in the first course, one of the investors gestured at his water glass, and Ryan replaced it without being asked twice. A small thing, the kind of small thing that the best service is made of. What Ryan also heard in that same moment was the investor say something in Mandarin to the man beside him, a comment about the temperature of the room, offhand and unremarkable. Ryan understood every word of it. He said nothing. He set the glass down and moved on. The trouble started 20 minutes into the second course. A younger member of the serving staff, a woman named Kara, who had been at Sterling House for less than 4 months, approached the table to clear a setting and caught the edge of a bread plate, sending it sliding. It didn't break. It barely made a sound. But Evelyn Brooks turned toward her as though she had dropped a tray of crystal in the middle of a funeral. Her expression shifted from performative warmth into something much colder, and her voice dropped to the kind of low register that somehow carries further than a raised one. "Is this your first week?" Evelyn said. Not as a question. Kara stood very still and apologized quietly. Evelyn looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then said without lowering her voice, "I need people on this floor tonight who are actually capable, not whoever they pulled from the lunch shift." She turned back to her guests, the dismissal complete and total, as though Kara had already left the room, even though she was still standing there. Ryan was 3 feet away. He had heard all of it. He moved to Kara's side naturally, not dramatically took the bread plate from her hands, and said to Evelyn calmly, and without any particular inflection, "My apologies for the interruption. We'll have this sorted immediately." His tone was the exact tone you were supposed to use in a moment like this, de-escalating professional without challenge. He was not trying to start anything. He was trying to close the gap quickly and move the evening forward. Evelyn looked at him as though noticing him for the first time, which perhaps she was. Her gaze traveled over him slowly, the uniform, the bread plate in his hand, the fact that he had spoken at all without being addressed. Then she said, in a voice that was now fully audible to the entire table, "I didn't ask for your input." Ryan said, "Of course. My apologies." He turned to go. He had taken 2 steps when her voice followed him. "Actually stay." It was not a request. "I want to understand something. How long have you been doing this job?" Ryan turned back. The table had gone quiet. Some of the investors were watching with the careful attention of people who understood exactly what kind of moment this was and had chosen for now not to intervene. Patricia had opened her notebook, but was not writing in it. She was watching. "A couple of years," Ryan said. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "A couple of years. And is this—" She gestured at him, a small motion that somehow encompassed the uniform, the bread plate of the entire situation. "Where you expected to end up?" The room did not move. Ryan looked at her steadily. He said nothing, because there was nothing he could say in that moment that would serve anyone well, including himself. He understood the mechanics of what she was doing. She was not asking a question. She was establishing something, a hierarchy, an atmosphere, a reminder to her guests about who held authority in this room. He was simply the instrument she had chosen to use for that purpose. Evelyn reached into the small clutch bag on the chair beside her, withdrew a folded bill, and held it out. When Ryan didn't immediately move toward her, she dropped it. It fell to the floor between them, a slow, deliberate drift of paper, and landed face up near the toe of his shoe. $100. She said, "Pick that up." Consider it a bonus for the interruption." Several people at the table looked away. The investors exchanged something between them, a glance, a fractional shift in posture, but said nothing aloud. Patricia set her pen down on the open page of her notebook. Ryan looked at the bill on the floor. He did not bend down. Evelyn's expression hardened slightly at his stillness. Then something else moved across her face, a kind of amusement, sharp and practiced. She looked at her guests and said in a tone designed to perform confidence to the room, "Here's something I've always found fascinating about this city. You can walk into any restaurant, any coffee shop, any hotel lobby, and you'll find someone exactly like this. Someone who thinks that because they've been polite, they've earned the right to stand there." She glanced back at Ryan. "You don't speak Mandarin, do you?" "Of course you don't." She looked at her guests again. "None of them do." Robert Walsh shifted in his seat. Something in the comment had not landed the way Evelyn intended, and his expression suggested he was processing what had just been implied about the people seated at his table as much as about Ryan. Patricia picked her pen back up and wrote something brief. Evelyn, not reading the room, leaned back slightly and said, "I'll tell you what. I will write a check for $100,000 tonight, right now, if the man standing in front of us can hold a real conversation in Mandarin. Not a phrase, not hello and thank you. A real conversation on any topic my guests choose." She said it the way people say things they are absolutely certain will never be tested. The table waited. Ryan stood with the $100 bill still on the floor between his feet and said nothing. He looked at Evelyn Brooks, and then he looked at the investors. And what he noticed, what he had been noticing for the past 2 minutes, actually, was that 2 of the men on the far side of the table had been speaking to each other in quiet Mandarin throughout the entire exchange. He had caught enough of it to understand that they were not entertained. They were uncomfortable. One of them had said, in the tone of someone choosing their words carefully, even in their own language, that the way the evening was being managed told them something important about how the partnership would be managed. The other had agreed. Ryan heard all of it. He had heard it as clearly as he heard anything in this room, in this language, which he had spent years learning to understand. Not from textbooks, but from being inside it, from living and working in environments where Mandarin was not a skill, but a requirement, where getting it wrong had professional consequences that far exceeded the professional consequences he was facing right now. He made a decision. It was not an impulsive one. He had in fact already made it the moment the money hit the floor. He bent down, picked up the $100 bill, and set it on the edge of the table. Not returned to Evelyn, just set aside. Then he looked at Robert Walsh, the man who had shifted in his seat, and began to speak. The Mandarin came out clean and unhurried, the kind of fluency that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Ryan addressed Walsh directly, acknowledging the discomfort of the last few minutes, noting that the evening's purpose was important, and that he hoped the tone of the dinner had not given the wrong impression about the project or the people behind it. He used a formal register appropriate to the context, not stiff or academic, but the kind of measured professional Mandarin that communicated respect for the listener and familiarity with the subject matter. He kept it brief. He was not performing. He was correcting something. The room went completely still. Evelyn Brooks stared at him. Walsh looked at Ryan for a long moment, and then he said something back in Mandarin, and Ryan answered without hesitation, and the 2 of them exchanged 4 or 5 sentences in the time it took everyone else in the room to understand what they were watching. Then Walsh looked across the table at his colleagues, and one of them said something that made 2 others nod slowly, and all of them looked at Ryan with an attention that had nothing performative about it. It was the attention people give when they have just recalibrated something. Patricia had stopped writing again. She was watching Ryan with the focused stillness of someone filing information away carefully. Evelyn said nothing. Her hands, Ryan noticed, were very still on the table in front of her. The composure was intact, but something behind it had gone rigid, like a structure that looks fine from the outside, but has already shifted at the foundation. Ryan looked at Evelyn and said in English, calmly and without emphasis, "Would you like me to continue with the service? Or is there something else?" She did not answer immediately. Around them, the dining room had resumed its ambient noise conversations, restarting silverware, moving the distant sound of the kitchen, but the table in the east wing remained a different kind of quiet, the kind that follows something that cannot be taken back. It was only the beginning of what the night would cost Evelyn Brooks, but standing there with the $100 bill sitting untouched on the corner of her own table, she did not yet know that. Evelyn Brooks was not a woman who lost gracefully. That much was clear to everyone in the East Wing within 30 seconds of Ryan finishing his last sentence. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and her expression arranged into something that looked like composure if you didn't look closely enough. But the investors were looking closely. That was the problem. These were men and women who had built careers on reading rooms, reading people, reading the space between what was said and what was meant. And what was happening now in the East Wing of Sterling House was very readable. Evelyn picked up her wine glass, set it down without drinking, and said to the table broadly, "Well, it seems our waiter has been practicing." The comment was designed to minimize, to reframe what had just happened as a parlor trick, a memorized performance, something that could be acknowledged and then moved past without disrupting the evening's larger architecture. She smiled as she said it, the smile precise and social, aimed at her guests with the expectation that they would return it and the room would reset. Walsh did not return the smile. He looked at Ryan and asked in English this time how long he had spoken Mandarin. Ryan told him several years of active use preceded by formal study that had begun much earlier. Walsh nodded slowly, the way someone nods when an answer confirms something they had already suspected. Then he said something to the man beside him in Mandarin, brief, low, and Ryan caught it without reacting visibly. Walsh had said that the waiter's register was better than that of the translator they had used at last month's meeting in Vancouver. Evelyn had not caught it because Evelyn did not speak Mandarin. This was Ryan understood the central and compounding problem she now faced. She tried a different approach. She addressed Ryan directly, her tone carrying a new edge beneath its surface polish. "I want to be clear that I find it a little unusual for someone in your position to be, let's say, selectively demonstrating skills that have nothing to do with the job you were hired to do." She said it the way people phrase things when they want to accuse without technically accusing. A few phrases is one thing, but what my guests need tonight is a sophisticated understanding of commercial real estate, international investment structures, and cross-border negotiation. That's a different matter entirely. It was a challenge framed as skepticism. Everyone at the table understood that. Ryan understood it most clearly of all. Walsh looked at Evelyn, and then at Ryan, curious, in a way that had moved past politeness into something more direct. He said to Ryan in Mandarin that, if he was comfortable, Walsh would appreciate his perspective on one specific aspect of the proposal that had been discussed before dinner, a question of land use classification under California state law, and how it interacted with the foreign investment restrictions his consortium was navigating. It was a technical question, the kind that required not just language, but context, legal familiarity, and working knowledge of how these deals were actually structured on the ground. Ryan answered in Mandarin. He was careful and precise, and he did not overreach. He stated clearly where his knowledge was solid and where he was working from general familiarity rather than specific expertise. But what he offered was accurate, structured, and immediately useful. And Walsh's expression shifted in the way expressions shift when someone has just saved you 20 minutes of confusion. Patricia, who had been watching the exchange with her pen held loosely over her notebook, set the pen down and asked a follow-up question in Mandarin, precise and technical, about a specific clause that had been flagged by their legal team before the trip. Her question was the kind that only gets asked by someone who has already read the contract in detail and identified exactly where the friction point is. Ryan walked through it methodically, explaining the distinction between how the clause read on paper and how it was typically interpreted in practice by California county assessors. Patricia wrote something in her notebook, not a quick note, but several lines, the kind of writing that means the answer has been useful enough to record properly. Evelyn watched all of this with the focused stillness of someone who has just watched a conversation move into a room she does not have the key to. Her advisors, the two men seated at the far end of the table, both of whom had been managing the English language components of the deal, had gone quiet. They had no entry point into what was happening. Ryan was standing at a serving station 3 feet from the table, speaking to the investors in their own language about the deal's structural weaknesses, and the investors were listening to him with more attention than they had given anyone else in the room all evening. Then Walsh said something that shifted the entire axis of the night. He addressed the table in English, which Ryan understood was a deliberate choice. Walsh wanted everyone present to hear this. He said that there was a clause in the proposed partnership agreement regarding profit repatriation that his team had flagged concerns about during their preliminary review, and that he had not raised it directly during the dinner because he had not wanted to create friction before the relationship had properly formed. He looked at Ryan and asked in the collegial tone of someone consulting a peer rather than a waiter whether Ryan had any familiarity with how that type of clause had played out in comparable deals. Ryan set down the water pitcher he was holding. He said in English that he did. He described 2 prior cases, broad strokes, no confidential specifics, where similar clauses had created downstream complications for the foreign partner because the repatriation timeline conflicted with state-level tax reporting requirements that hadn't been fully accounted for in the original agreement. He recommended that Walsh's legal team request a specific amendment before signing. The amendment was a standard one in international commercial real estate at this scale, but only if you knew to ask for it. The table went quiet in a different way than it had before. The earlier quiet had been the quiet of surprise. This was the quiet of people doing math. One of Walsh's colleagues, a man named Douglas, the most senior member of the delegation based on how the others deferred to him, leaned forward slightly and said in English that what Ryan had just described was precisely the issue their legal counsel had been unable to articulate clearly. They had known something was wrong with the clause. They had not been able to name it. Douglas had the manner of a man who did not say things like that lightly, and the weight of the statement landed accordingly. Evelyn's lead advisor, the man on her right, opened his mouth and then closed it. He knew what Ryan had just said was correct. He also knew he should have said it first weeks ago when the draft agreement had crossed his desk. Evelyn pushed back from the table slightly, not enough to stand just enough to signal that she was repositioning. Her voice when she spoke was controlled, but had lost the quality it had carried at the start of the evening. The ease was gone. What remained was effort, wearing ease as a costume. She said to Ryan with the deliberateness of someone choosing each word with care, "I think you've made your point, but I also think it's time for you to return to your actual responsibilities for the evening." She looked at Gerald, the floor manager, who had been standing near the entrance to the East Wing for the past several minutes, with the expression of a man who very much wished he were somewhere else. "Gerald, I'd like a different member of staff assigned to this table." Gerald moved toward Ryan with an apologetic look that communicated volumes. Ryan understood. He nodded and began to step back. Walsh said in a voice that was quiet, but carried the weight of someone who did not often need volume to be heard. "Actually, I'd prefer he stay." The request landed in the room like something solid. Evelyn looked at Walsh. Walsh looked back at her with the pleasant, impassive expression of a man who had just made a business decision and was waiting for the room to catch up. The dynamic had shifted so completely and so quickly that the geography of the table now felt rearranged, as though Walsh were at the head of it and Evelyn were a guest. Evelyn said after a moment, "Of course." She said it smoothly. She had no other option. but her hand flat on the table pressed slightly harder against the linen. She regrouped in the way that people with real resources regroup, not by retreating, but by escalating. She took out her phone, and within a few minutes, she had sent a message to someone. She told the table with returned composure that she had just reached out to an independent language and cultural consultant, a man named Dr. Richard Hale, based in Seattle, who worked with major international firms on cross-cultural communication, and whose credentials were, she said, well established. She said she wanted to bring him into the dinner via video, not because she doubted what had happened, but because she felt the investors deserved a formal and objective assessment of what they were working with. She framed it as a service to her guests. Everyone at the table understood it was not. Patricia looked up from her notebook when Evelyn said this. She exchanged a brief glance with Douglas, the kind of glance that carries a full sentence in it, and then looked back down at her notes without comment. Dr. Richard Hale appeared on a tablet screen that one of Evelyn's assistants positioned at the end of the table within 15 minutes. He was a man in his early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the careful manner of someone accustomed to being the most informed person in a room. Evelyn explained the situation in 2 sentences. Hale looked at Ryan through the screen and said in English that he would conduct the assessment in 3 parts: conversational fluency, professional register, and cultural context, and that he would ask Ryan to respond only in Mandarin throughout. Gerald had not moved Ryan from the table. He was still standing there. His job technically was the table. The table had requested he stay. These facts were in tension with each other, and Gerald had resolved the tension by doing nothing and hoping it resolved itself. Ryan looked at the screen, looked at Hale, and said in Mandarin that he was ready whenever Hale wanted to begin. What followed was not brief. Hale began with questions that were genuinely complex, not conversational warm-ups, but structured assessments covering professional contexts that required not just vocabulary, but the ability to navigate formality levels, implied meanings, and the kind of cultural subtext that doesn't exist in any textbook. He asked Ryan to respond to a hypothetical negotiation scenario in which one party was using indirect language to signal withdrawal from an agreement without stating it explicitly, and to explain in Mandarin what signals he was reading and how he would respond. He asked about regional dialect variation and when code switching between registers was appropriate in a business context versus a relationship-building context. He asked Ryan to explain a concept from American commercial law using only vocabulary that a Chinese business executive without legal training would find immediately accessible. Ryan answered each section without breaking the register, without reaching for simpler constructions to compensate for difficulty, and without the kind of marginal hesitation that even competent second language speakers show when a question catches them at the edge of their ability. He was not at the edge of his ability. The questions were hard, but they were not harder than conversations he had navigated in rooms very different from this one. Years before he had ever learned to carry a bread plate without making a sound. The table watched. Evelyn watched. Patricia had closed her notebook and was watching with her hands flat on the table, her full attention on the screen, and on Ryan in equal measure. Gerald watched from the doorway holding a pen he had stopped using. Hale finished his 3rd section and looked at Ryan through the screen for a long moment. Then he said in English, clearly, and without qualification, that Ryan's Mandarin was not intermediate, not conversational, and not the product of intensive recent study. It was the fluency of someone who had lived and worked inside the language at a professional level for an extended period. His register control was precise, his cultural contextualizing was accurate, and his ability to navigate the negotiation scenario had been, Hale said, frankly better than most of the executives Hale worked with professionally on cross-cultural communication. He said this without looking at Evelyn. He did not need to. Evelyn sat at the head of a table where every investor was now looking at the waiter with the focused interest they had come to the dinner, planning to give to her. Douglas looked at Walsh and said something in Mandarin. Ryan heard it. Walsh heard it. Patricia heard it, and wrote a single line in her notebook without looking down at the page. What Douglas said was that they needed to find out who this man actually was before they signed anything, because whoever had advised Evelyn Brooks tonight had clearly not been paying attention, and they needed to understand whether that was a pattern. Ryan heard that too. He did not show it on his face. But something shifted in him, not pride, not satisfaction, something quieter than either of those. The long patience of a person who had waited a very long time for the room to catch up. Evelyn's composure was still in place, but it was the kind of composure that has become its own burden, something you cannot put down, because putting it down would cost more than continuing to carry it. She looked at Ryan, and for the first time since she had dropped that $100 bill on the floor, she looked at him without calculation. Just looked, as though she were trying to reconcile two things that would not reconcile. Ryan looked back at her, steady and without performance, and waited for what came next. Douglas was the one who asked the question that nobody else had said out loud yet. He did it in English, which again felt like a deliberate choice, the same way Walsh had chosen English earlier, when he wanted the whole room to hear something. Douglas set down his teacup, looked at Ryan directly, and said, "I'd like to understand something. You clearly have a background that goes well beyond this room. So what is it exactly that you're doing here?" It was not an unkind question. It was the question of a man who had spent decades making decisions based on accurate information, and who had just discovered that the information available to him about this room had been incomplete. He was not asking to embarrass Ryan. He was asking because the answer mattered to him professionally, and Ryan sensed on some other level as well. The East Wing had gone fully quiet. The ambient noise of the main dining room continued beyond the partition, the low hum of other conversations, the occasional sound of glassware. But inside the East Wing, the only thing moving was attention. Everyone at the table was looking at Ryan. Gerald was looking at Ryan from the doorway. Patricia had her notebook open again, but her pen was still. Even Evelyn, whose expression had been carefully managed all evening, was looking at Ryan with something that had moved past strategy into plain curiosity. Ryan set the water pitcher down on the service station behind him. He did not move to the table or position himself as though he were presenting to the room. He stood where he was in the uniform in the light, and he answered the question honestly and without theater. He told them that he had spent nearly a decade working as an international business consultant, primarily in cross-border transactions across Asia and North America. He had been based in Shanghai for 4 of those years, which was where the Mandarin had gone from academic to functional, and then from functional to what it currently was. He had worked on deals, not unlike the one being discussed tonight: infrastructure, investment, commercial real estate, foreign capital, navigating domestic regulatory environments. He had been good at it. He had for a period of time been very good at it. Then he said simply that his personal life had come apart in a way that made continuing in that world impossible at the time. He did not elaborate on the specifics. He said that he had made the choice to step away to rebuild more slowly, and that the work at Sterling House had been part of that process, not an accident, not a failure, but a deliberate decision to stay grounded while he figured out the next thing. He said it without apology, and without the particular kind of performance that people sometimes use when they want credit for their hardship. He was just accounting for the gap between who he had been and where he was standing now. The table absorbed this. Patricia uncapped her pen and wrote something more than a line this time. Douglas nodded slowly, the way he had nodded earlier, the nod of a man confirming something he had already half-formed as a hypothesis. Walsh leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, which Ryan read as a man doing fast arithmetic about something that had just become more complicated and more interesting at the same time. Evelyn said nothing. Her wine glass was in front of her untouched for the last 20 minutes. It was Douglas who spoke next. He said that his consortium was currently expanding its advisory infrastructure for North American deals, and that the gap they consistently ran into wasn't capital and not legal counsel. Both of those were manageable. The gap was people who could operate fluently on both sides of a transaction, the cultural, the linguistic, and the structural. People who understood not just what a contract said, but what each party understood the contract to mean, which were frequently two different things. He said they had been looking for some time for someone who could work in that space, and that tonight had been, among other things, an unexpected interview. He said this with the dry precision of a man who was not making a joke, but understood that it had the shape of one. Ryan looked at Douglas steadily and said that he appreciated the thought. He said it the way someone says something when they mean it, and are also still processing what it means. Walsh added that they would want to follow up formally outside of this context, and that they would make sure the conversation happened through the right channels. He said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone converting a decision into a logistical step. Patricia looked up from her notebook and said directly and without preamble that she would personally make sure the follow-up was scheduled before the delegation left San Francisco. She said it the way someone says something when they have already decided it is going to happen and are simply informing the room. Something in the East Wing settled not the tension of the earlier part of the evening, but the particular quiet of people who have reached the end of a negotiation and know it even if the paperwork hasn't caught up yet. Evelyn put her wine glass down. She looked around the table at her guests and then back at Ryan, and something had changed in her face. Not dramatically, not the way faces change in the kinds of stories where people collapse into revelation. It was smaller than that and more real. The architecture of control was still there, but it was no longer doing the work it had been doing at the start of the evening. She said in a voice that was quieter than the one she had used all night, "I owe you an apology." She did not dress it up. She did not preface it with qualifications or context. She said it directly, which was, Ryan thought, probably the hardest way for her to say it. "What I said earlier was out of line. The way I treated you, and the way I treated your colleague, that was wrong. I'm saying that plainly." The table was very still. Ryan said, "I appreciate that." He said it without warmth and without coldness, just a receipt, an acknowledgement that the thing had been said and had landed. He was not going to perform forgiveness for the room's comfort, and he was not going to withhold it to make a point. He simply noted that it had been said and let it sit there. Evelyn reached into her clutch bag and withdrew a checkbook, an actual paper checkbook, which in a room full of people who moved billions across digital platforms had a slightly surreal quality. She wrote the check for $100,000 with the focused efficiency of someone who had written large checks before and understood that the most dignified way to honor a debt was to do it without commentary. She tore it out and held it across the table toward Ryan. He crossed the few feet between the service station and the table and took it from her hand, without hurry. Douglas looked at the check, looked at Ryan and said, "Well earned." Two of the other investors made sounds of agreement. Patricia closed her notebook and set it aside, which felt in the context of the evening like its own kind of statement. Then something else happened, something that had not been orchestrated, and that no one, including Ryan, had anticipated. It started at a table near the partition, where two couples had been having dinner and had been aware in the way that people in restaurants become aware of unusual things nearby, that something significant had been unfolding in the East Wing for the past hour. They had not been able to hear everything, but they had heard enough, the tone of it, the shape of it, the moment when the room had changed. One of the men at that table stood up. He began to clap slowly and deliberately, not the polite applause of someone filling silence, but the kind of clapping that means something, that is saying something the person cannot find another way to say. His companion stood, then the couple across from them, then a table further in, and another near the window, and within 30 seconds, the main dining room of Sterling House was standing, not universally, but substantially enough that the sound of it reached the kitchen and brought two of the cooks to the pass-through window to look out at what was happening. Ryan stood in the middle of the East Wing, holding a check for $100,000, and felt for the first time in a long time the specific discomfort of being seen. Not assessed, not judged, not evaluated for utility, actually seen. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not uncomfortable either. It was the feeling of something that had been closed for a long time being opened, and the air coming in being different from what you remembered air feeling like. He did not raise his hands. He did not perform the moment. He stood there and let it be what it was. Gerald from the doorway was clapping too. He had stopped pretending he knew what his role was in the situation approximately 45 minutes ago, and had arrived at the conclusion that the correct thing to do was simply to be present and honest about what he was witnessing. He caught Ryan's eye and gave him a small nod, the nod of a man who had worked alongside someone for 2 years and was revising his understanding of that person in real time, and who found to his credit that the revision was not difficult to make. In the weeks that followed, Ryan met with Douglas and Walsh twice, once in a downtown conference room and once over coffee in a quieter setting where the conversation could move more freely. Patricia attended the second meeting and arrived with a prepared list of questions that told Ryan she had spent time on this, which he respected. The formal offer came from Douglas's office, a consulting role attached to the consortium's North American Advisory Board, structured to allow flexibility, with a scope that mapped closely to the work Ryan had done a decade earlier, but in a context that had changed considerably in the intervening years. Ryan read the offer document carefully and asked 2 questions. Both were answered. He accepted. He did not leave Sterling House immediately. He worked out his remaining schedule, covered the shifts he had agreed to cover, and said goodbye to the people he had worked alongside. Kara, the young server from the night of the dinner, hugged him at the end of his last shift, which surprised them both. Gerald shook his hand and said without irony that Ryan had been the best person on the floor, and that he had never found that easy to say to people, but was saying it now because the situation seemed to require it. With a portion of the $100,000, Ryan established a small fund administered through a community education nonprofit he had researched over several evenings at his kitchen table. The fund was simple in structure. It provided financial support for working adults who wanted to pursue language learning or professional development, but could not absorb the cost without assistance. He did not name it after himself. He gave it a name that described what it did, and he set up a board of 3 people to manage the applications, and then he let it run without making it a public story. Evelyn Brooks completed the deal with the investor consortium, though it took 2 additional months and 3 rounds of contract revisions, including the amendment Ryan had identified on the night of the dinner. Douglas's legal team had insisted on it. She did not contact Ryan directly after the evening at Sterling House, but 6 months later, her office reached out to the consultancy he had joined, requesting a scoping conversation about a new cross-border project. The request went through the standard intake process. Ryan was assigned to the preliminary assessment. He prepared the briefing document and sent it to her team without comment. The restaurant kept the story in the way that institutions keep stories, not officially, not in writing, but in the retelling. Gerald told a version of it at the annual staff dinner that December abbreviated and slightly improved in the telling, as stories always are. The table in the East Wing was the same table it had always been. The linen was still pressed. The lighting was still low and deliberate. Nothing about the room had changed, except that the people who worked in it carried a different awareness of what rooms like this can contain, and what they can miss, and what they sometimes on an ordinary evening cannot afford to overlook. Ryan did not think about the night at Sterling House very often after it was over. Not because it had not mattered, but because the things it had set in motion were more interesting to him than the event itself. The event was a door. What was through the door was what required attention. He had spent enough of his life looking back at doors he had already walked through, and he had learned at some cost that the practice was not useful. What was useful was the work in front of him, which was considerable, and the knowledge he had built over years that nobody had given him and nobody could take back, and the quiet fact of having stood in a room and been himself completely without announcement, without apology, and having let that be enough. It had been enough. It had, as it turned out, been more than enough.